Elizabeth II Charles, Prince of Wales Elizabeth II Boris Johnson Dominic Raab Elizabeth II the Lord McFall of Alcluith, Sir Lindsay Hoyle Sir Keir Starmer Supreme Court the Lord Reid the Lord Hodge The Ministry of Defence is the British government department responsible for implementing the defence policy set by Her Majesty's government, and is the headquarters of the British Armed Forces. It is the UK's Ministry of Defence. The MOD states that its principal objectives are to defend the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and its interests and to strengthen international peace and stability. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the MOD does not foresee any short-term conventional military threat. Rather, it has identified weapons of mass destruction, international terrorism, and failed and failing states as the overriding threats to Britain's interests. The MOD also manages day-to-day running of the armed forces, contingency planning and defence procurement. During the 1920s and 1930s, British civil servants and politicians, looking back at the performance of the state during the First World War, concluded that there was a need for greater coordination between the three services that made up the Armed Forces of the United Kingdom, the Royal Navy, the British Army and the Royal Air Force. The formation of a united Ministry of Defence was rejected by David Lloyd George's coalition government in 1921, but the Chiefs of Staff Committee was formed in 1923 for the purposes of inter-service coordination. As rearmament became a concern during the 1930s, Stanley Baldwin created the position of Minister for Coordination of Defence. Lord Chatfield held the post until the fall of Neville Chamberlain's government in 1940. His success was limited by his lack of control over the existing service departments and his limited political influence. Winston Churchill, on forming his government in 1940, created the Office of Minister of Defence to exercise ministerial control over the Chiefs of Staff Committee and to coordinate defence matters. The post was held by the Prime Minister of the day until Clement Attlee's government introduced the Ministry of Defence Act of 1946. From 1946, the three posts of Secretary of State for War, First Lord of the Admiralty, and Secretary of State for Air were formally subordinated to the new Minister of Defence, who possessed a seat in the cabinet. The said three service ministers, Admiralty, War, Air, remained in direct operational control of their respective services, but ceased to attend cabinet. From 1946 to 1964, 5 departments of state did the work of the modern Ministry of Defence: the Admiralty, the War Office, the Air Ministry, the Ministry of Aviation, and an earlier form of the Ministry of Defence. These departments merged in 1964. The defence functions of the Ministry of Aviation Supply merged into the Ministry of Defence in 1971. The unification of all defence activities under a single ministry was motivated by a desire to curb inter-service rivalries and followed the precedent set by the American National Security Act of 1947. The ministers in the Ministry of Defence are as follows. The People Programme, a state service family accommodation policy and engagement with welfare, works with Cabinet Office. The Chief of the Defence Staff is the professional head of the British Armed Forces and the most senior uniformed military advisor to the Secretary of State for Defence and the Prime Minister. The CDS is supported by the Vice Chief of the Defence Staff who deputizes and is responsible for the day-to-day running of the armed services aspect of the MOD through the Central Staff, working closely alongside the Permanent Secretary. They are joined by the professional heads of the 3 British Armed Services and the Commander of Strategic Command. All personnel sit at OF9 rank in the NATO rank system. Together the Chiefs of Staff form the Chiefs of Staff Committee with responsibility for providing advice on operational military matters and the preparation and conduct of military operations. The current Chiefs of Staff are as follows. The Chief of Staff is supported by several Deputy Chief of the Defence Staffs and senior officers at OF8 rank. Additionally, there are a number of Assistant Chiefs of Defence Staff, including the Defence Services Secretary in the Royal Household of the Sovereign of the United Kingdom. who is also the Assistant Chief of Defense Staff, Permanent Secretary and other senior officials. The Ministers-in-Chiefs of the Defense Staff are supported by several civilian, scientific and professional military advisors. The Permanent Under-Secretary of State for Defense is the senior civil servant at the MOD. Their role is to ensure that it operates effectively as a government department and has responsibility for the strategy, performance, reform, organization and the finances of the MOD. The role works closely with